it isn't appropriate. And so in his interview with me, he changed the word communist all the way through to very extreme socialist. Well, within 6 months, he himself, all over the front page of his newspaper, was and continues to routinely use the word communist to describe President Obama, because that is what he is. And we know that Van Jones, his now sacked jobs czar, was an open communist, that Obama knew that when he appointed him and appointed him anyway. There are many, many signs of the communism of Obama, not least the way he is systematically destroying capitalism by simply spending too much money at government level and not allowing the people to keep enough to spend for themselves. That is knocking the stuffing out of corporations right across America. It's causing jobs to go overseas to jurisdictions where the government hasn't gone mad and is no longer practicing that kind of communism. Even the Communist Party in China no longer practices the kind of stupid communism that Obama has been practicing at government level. And the answer to that, I'm afraid, and I'm going to be interfering in your elections here in a way that I shouldn't, the midterm elections are almost upon us. For heaven's sake, don't vote communist.
No, of course not. And but what does that mean? That means that even if it's a Republican, if they aren't standing or their track record doesn't show fiscal conservatism or an appreciation of property rights, then don't vote them in just because they're Republican, just because they're the other side. That doesn't do you any good.
That's right, and I'm very, very glad that my friends in the Tea Party movement have been reminding the Republican Party of its roots in fiscal conservatism. And they've said, we've got to get back to running a sound currency, running sound national accounts, not spraying around, TARP money in all directions. TARP money is taxpayers' money. It's your money and mine that's being sprayed around by these lunatic administrations that we have in both our countries. This has got to stop.
Yes,
and the way to stop it is to make sure that you hold, in particular, your Republican candidates to account. And as you say, if they are rhinos, Republicans in name only, then they shouldn't get your vote. Just vote for, stand yourself as a fiscal conservative candidate, and you'll take some votes from the Republicans. And if that lets the Democrat in, it will remind the Republicans that they should have chosen somebody who was a real Republican and not a Republican in name only. I went and met one or two of the officials of the Republican National Committee in Washington last year, and I was enormously unimpressed. These people were not conservatives in any real sense at all. They were bureaucrats just like the other side. I'm glad to say that the congressmen and senators I met, on the whole, are more robust than the National Committee is. But it's time now for the Republicans to rediscover their roots in fiscal conservatism and start standing up and saying that the days of regarding taxpayers' money as the property of the government rather than the property of the taxpayer are over.
Lord Monckton, do we have time for one question from the audience?
Yes, of course.
Okay, very good. I have Adrian from the UK. You're live on the show, Adrian.
Hello?
Yes, sir. We can hear you loud and clear.
Heard that one.
Hello there.
97. Hello. And heard that 97% of the money in circulation is nothing more than digits on a computer screen, and the other is just notes. But this 97% is created in banks every day, even private banks on fractional reserve system. I think the fractional reserve ratio is 10%. So they're creating 90% out of thin air on their balance sheets, and the Bank of England is just like the Federal Reserve, a private organisation creating money out of thin air, lending it to the government at interest, and all the interest, which is being paid back to the Bank of England, which is another area of private organisation, goes to these private banks. Banks is mainly the big powerful one is the Rothschilds, and people with the depression and the recession, people losing their houses over money that was never there.
That's a very good point. And let's just get one thing clear. You say that the reserve ratio, the fractional reserve ratio used by banks is around 10%. That has long been regarded as what's called a prudential ratio. In other words, you can lend at any one time 10 times as much as the deposits you've got in, because you know that in a typical banking day, that will always mean you've got enough deposits to cover the amount of money that people wanting their deposits back will require. But in Bear Stearns and in Lehman Brothers, they had decided to go much more highly geared than that, and they had a fractional reserve ratio, would you believe it, of only 2 or 3%. And of course, the moment anything went wrong, the banks went belly up. Now, of course, you're quite right that fractional reserve lending is what brings most of the currencies of today into existence. However, it is still the case that what determines inflation is the rate at which governments print money. So-called, they now call it quantitative easing to make it sound rather grand and respectable. It isn't. It is debasement of the currency. And the way to start getting the financial system back under some discipline is to make sure that governments no longer issue currencies, that you issue sound and fully asset-backed currencies with competing currency boards doing the work for you. And that way, there is sound money at the heart of the system. And that, in turn, imposes a beneficent pressure on the banks to make sure that their own lending becomes prudential. And provided you do maintain a proper reserve ratio, not 2 or 3% that drove several banks under, but at least 10, then that's enough to keep the financial system stable. So you're quite right to raise this issue of fractional reserve lending, which sounds a bit like voodoo, but I can see the sense in that, provided that you have an honest currency underpinning it. But if you have fractional reserve lending, A, at too low a fractional rate, the 2 or 3% rather than 10% that used to be regarded as normal, and B, with an unsound paper currency that's being inflated by so-called quantitative easing, that's a recipe for disaster. And we have to get away from that. We have to have a proper fractional reserve in place again, minimum of 10%, and I would probably prefer it more like 12 or 15, and also a sound currency. That's the really solid foundation for a proper, long-lasting economic recovery in the Western world.
Well, thank you so much, Lord Monckton, for coming on the show tonight. I'm running up against a break, so again, you're welcome anytime you want to come on the show and talk to us about especially some of the latest things that you're doing in the world of activism and everything else. We'd be more than happy to have you back on anytime, but I thank you so much for your insight, and that plan is definitely wonderful and something that should be talked about a lot more, especially in circles in the United States.
Well, many thanks. It's been a great pleasure to bounce some of these ideas off you. I am working on setting up a currency board in Scotland, and will shortly be going to see the First Minister, who's an old friend of mine, to recommend it to him. Then if he likes the idea, we can make sure we have some government representatives on the board to make sure that it is run as they would wish it to be run. And then Scotland will have its own currency for the first time in the last couple of 100 years. And what will be interesting, if we do get away with doing this, is that if we are the first, then everyone round the world is going to want to put their savings into the talent rather than in their own currencies, for a rather interesting technical reason, apart from the fact that at least the talent holds its value. But the other reason is that because it holds its value, because it's a zero inflation currency, because it's fully backed by assets, that means that the interest rate that people who lend money in that currency will pay will be less in nominal terms than the interest rate they'd have to pay for an inflating currency, because part of it, the nominal part of the interest, is just to compensate for inflation. But you're taxed on your unearned income on not only the real part of the interest you receive, but also on the nominal part that purely compensates you for inflation. So if you have a zero inflation currency and you lend money in that currency, you save in that currency, if you save your lending money, then you will receive much more money, even at a lower rate of interest, than you would have received if you'd invested the same amount of money at a high rate of interest in an inflating currency. And so everyone in the world who has savings will have a direct tax interest in saving money that way.
Well, thank you so much, Lord Monckton. We loved having you on the show. Folks, when we come back, more of Freedom, Love, and Talk.
Most Americans know the significance of July 4th, 1776. However, few know the importance of September 17th, 1787, the day the Constitution was written and adopted by our founders. Unfortunately, over 200 years later, this sacred